Oh, hi, and welcome to Ideas and Images. Today's program is going to be a story. Now, don't go into shock. It's not going to be once upon a time. It's going to be a small speck of history. Now, there's a prologue to the story. I have a very dear friend of mine named Bry, short for Brian. Brian approached me one day and he said, would you please speak to my 6th grade class? I said, why? He said, well, the teacher told me that any student who brought in an adult would get extra credits. I said, oh, all right, fine. But why don't you ask your father? Your father's a much better, much more experienced speaker than I am. And he said he doesn't have a sword. I said, just a minute, please. Are you saying that you want me or the sword? And he said, no, I want both of you. I said, look, Brian, I haven't seen that sword in ages. I don't have the foggiest idea where it is. He said, I know where it is. Now, this is in my house. He knows where it is. I'm tempted to say, well, if you know where it is, why don't you pay the taxes? But I'm not going to say that to him. I'm just going to let him bring the sword back. He brought the sword back to me, and the sword was not in showcase condition. Since it wasn't in showcase condition, I told him, look, Brian, I'll take it down to a craftsman and have him try to refurbish the sword so that it'll be in a showcase condition for you. But however, I can't guarantee that it will be ready in time for your class. He said, that's all right, you come anyhow. So I came and I went through the class. Now, it was while I was going through this story at the class that I began to regurgitate that which I hadn't regurgitated in years, to wit, World War II. And now the story. The scene is in the East China Sea, on an island called Okinawa. Okinawa is an island in the archipelago called the Ryukyu chain. The Ryukyu chain is the next step to the mainland of Japan. Now, the operation at Okinawa was a joint operation. Army, Marine, with Navy shelling from ships. I was a Marine, and my assignment had been to CICA. Translated, CICA means Combat Intelligence Collection Agency. The purpose was to gather as much information for order of battle. What does that mysterious phrase mean? It means that you're trying to acquire information, identifying the units that are opposing you there, and the units that may be opposing you in the landing in Japan. In order to obtain some of this information, my mission on this particular day was the 24th Japanese Naval Headquarters. It had been bypassed by our forces, the entire entrance to the cave. And the cave was an immense subterranean, the opening to an immense subterranean underground. It would be incredible. Anyway, in order to enter the cave, it was necessary to pass through a cleared minefield. Now, I've always been rather a nervous guy. And when the phrase minefield cleared, I keep wondering, I hope the hell that function, the equipment didn't malfunction, and I hope the guy who operated knew what he was doing. And he did, and I returned. Returning to CICA, I heard about a mission the following day. And the following day's mission was the most intriguing mission that anyone could ever hear of. It was a mission wherein American forces that combined in this instance, Marine and Naval force, would attempt to persuade a garrison commander of a small island off the west coast of Okinawa to surrender his battalion. I should have mentioned to you that there were about 6 teardrop islands to the west of Okinawa. And the island where this garrison was located of a battalion was the island of Okinawa. Now, before I had arrived, I had told you I had been on a mission to the 24th Japanese Naval Headquarters. And when I returned, all the preparation had been made. So I was really listening. The following morning, appointed hour for departure, there were 2 Marines scheduled. 1 Marine showed up. He said, "I don't feel well. I'm afraid I can't go." The colonel turned around, examined. There were 4 Marine officers, by the way. There were 4 American naval language officers who were children of American missionaries in Japan. So the colonel looked around. He said, "Hey, any of you care to go?" So I said, "Yeah, I'll go." Now I've made the commitment. I had volunteered. And there's something you learn in service. Do anything you want, but never volunteer. But somewhere along the line, I had made several mistakes, and that was one of my possible major mistakes. After he accepted me, a co-captain in the Marines named Gleason pulled me aside, and he asked me a question. He said, "When did you lose your brains?" I said, "Why?" He said, "There have been several attempts to negotiate a surrender with the Japanese." I said, "Go ahead, please." And he said, "None of the Americans ever walked back." I said, "Oh, you're cheering me up in the wind. It's exactly what I needed." But nonetheless, the commitment was made, and I would stand by the commitment. The following day, we assembled. The assembly. 2 Marines, myself and the colonel, 2 Japanese naval language, 2 American naval officers, Japanese experts, and we were going to rendezvous with another group who were controlling a number of Japanese officer prisoners. One of the Japanese officer prisoners was a major. Now, he was the key to the entire operation. He was the key, and if he could unlock, and the lock was the major commanding the garrison on that island, if he could unlock the key, we were home free, and we would have had the first negotiated surrender. How did the major who was a prisoner, let me refer to him as a prisoner major. He's a Japanese, and you'll understand this. They had been classmates at the Japanese Imperial Military Academy in Tokyo. They knew each other well, they were pals. This feeling was very, very strong because there was a most persuasive appeal to patriotism. Now, if you were to define patriotism, you would say, hey, that's love of country and a willingness to defend it. But patriotism can be reversed. You can approach with patriotism as your objective, persuading that if you are patriotic, meaning you love your country, you will do everything in the world to save your country, because after this war is over, there's going to be very, very little left of Japan. And Japan is going to need all the brains it has available. The Japanese officers, oddly enough, many of them understood and grasped this. So we met this party, we boarded a mothership, went offshore to the island of Okinawa. Now, the island of Okinawa is in itself rather an interesting place. As I told you, it's a teardrop island. If you look at the photograph, you'll see an opening through the front of the boat, or the bow of the boat. And the guy on the right happens to be me. The guy in the center is a Japanese naval language officer. And the guy on the left is a soldier guarding the prisoners. If you notice that there are hills on the right. Now, there's a companion hill on the left. And enclosed, and both project, incidentally, possibly 25 feet into the water. The beach, you may be able to see the sand on the beach. The beach is enclosed, you might say, embraced by these 2 hills. The very first person off the landing craft was a man on your right with a cap and no shirt. He was a Japanese officer prisoner. He ran off the boat, walked very, very slowly to the left, not to this particular hill, but to the other hill, the companion hill. And with his loudspeaker, called to the soldiers, Japanese soldiers, please, don't shoot. We're here as friends, not as invaders. Because if you were to look in the hills, the Japanese simply could not conceal movement. There was some movement in the hills, and you knew where they were located. And one of the more frightening moments took place at about this time. A shot rang out. And now your first impulse when you hear a shot is to throw yourself flat on the ground and swivel your head to try to locate the source of the shot. Because of the nature of this particular mission, most of us did not fall down. Some of the soldiers did, because this was their training. Most of us, of the officers, did not, because they didn't want to, the Japanese to feel that this is more than merely, hey, may we talk with you business. I turned around, I saw a soldier, and he was the most embarrassed kid in the world. He had accidentally discharged a round. And I can't tell you how grateful I was to discover that it was accidental. And incidentally, you can get killed very, very easily with an accidental bullet. I really should backtrack it for a minute to make this a little more clear, because I have not made it clear. We were on the island. Why were we on the island? We were on the island because the Japanese naval office, the American naval officers had circumnavigated the island, had broadcast appeals to anyone on the island to please come down and talk to us. No answer. At that particular night, these two naval officers did something that, frankly, I'm not too sure I would do. They stripped down to their undershorts and swam into shore, carrying an orange cloth and a bag, with a watertight bag with a message in it, and the message contained the information, please, we'd like to talk to you. We are not invaders. If you want to talk to us, if you will, please talk to us. Leave the stand with the orange cloth in place and remove the other two. There were three of them. And lo and behold, the two were removed and the one with the orange cloth was in place. We now knew that we had a date. So when we landed on the beach, all we were doing now was waiting for the Japanese party to approach. Now I must come back to the hills. I'm sorry to bounce back and forth, but unfortunately this is the nature of the story. Each hill converged, both hills converged to a point where they almost formed the top of a triangle, but they didn't quite meet. And between these two hills was a wide path, and the wide path would allow passage for troops. And one of the, I think one of the most gratifying sights for a soldier is to see a path being filled with soldiers approaching you, and these soldiers are waving a white flag. I advanced with the two naval officers to greet them. And the reason for their coming down to the beach was later discovered. The reason simply was to verify that the Japanese naval officer, our prisoner, was in fact his classmate. Now the Japanese prisoner had been wounded severely in battle, to the point where he was ambulatory. Therefore, he had to be carried on a stretcher. When he was first approached, incidentally, by the naval officers to participate in this, he waited very carefully. He said, I'll go, provided my guard will come with me. And his guard was a black American sergeant from Harlem named Sergeant Price, a very brave guy. The Japanese party verified that our prisoner was in fact a classmate of the island commander. The battalion adjutant and a few others returned. We sat down on the beach with the remainder, which included the battalion sergeant major, and we talked. When I say we talked, they talked. They, the Japanese and the language officers talked. One of the questions that the Japanese one of the questions that the Japanese asked was, do you have any pictures of your family? And none of them said, no, we don't. We all said, no, we don't. He said, well, he brought out a picture, and he showed us his family, and they were a delightful family, one boy, one girl. And the thought hit my mind, my gosh, it's just like an American family, one boy, one girl, typical four-member American family. He said, you sure you don't have a picture? And I thought I had something. So I felt in my pocket, and I brought out a small snapshot of my wife. They passed the photograph around, eventually came to the Sergeant Major, and the Japanese have a unique way of expressing pleasure. Instead of the sibilant sound of you booing someone or hissing at someone, they have an end-taking sound, and this expresses joy. So the Sergeant Major fell in love with the picture. So the Sergeant Major went to the language officer. The language officer came to me and said, the Japanese Sergeant Major wants to know if he may have your wife's picture. To tell you the truth, I would have sold my wife into slavery to effect a surrender. I said, sure, by all means, do it. Now, another party approaches, again with the white flag. But this time, it's the island commander, the major. Now, we had it so planned that the bulk of those on the beach would be entirely separated from the two majors, so they may converse with relative privacy. And yet, as far as I was concerned, they could speak with total privacy because I don't understand any word they were saying. As they continued talking, I noted that the words and the actions became more animated. Eventually, it closed. The conversation closed. The Japanese major, the garrison commander, stood up and saluted and walked away, leaving the message, he will provide his answer tomorrow. We carried the Japanese prisoner major back to the craft with the black sergeant, and the following day we got the message from the island commander. The island commander said, my emperor, and you must understand, to the Japanese, Hirohito was not merely an emperor. He was more than an emperor. He was a god. So when he said no, that was it. Emotionally, I think we were all drained by the experience. Well, that's an exaggerated word, but we were all, my inside, I know, were churning as if I were preparing an internal stew. I was bitterly disappointed that we were a failure. No one likes to be party to a failure. Yet, on the other hand, I was elated that I walked away. Now, there is, I told you, a prologue and a short story. And if you have a prologue, you should have an epilogue. And the epilogue, I know you forgot one of the more important parts of the speech. Before we left the island, after we received the notice from the major that the emperor said no, and we had this thought, we, meaning the Marine Colonel, supposing we all kneel and pray for peace. And what you see in the second photograph is, wherever you see a person kneeling, you're looking at an American. Anyone sitting on their haunches is Japanese. Those who are wearing white shirts are prisoners, officer prisoners of ours. Those wearing tannish uniforms are island soldiers. In the epilogue, for example, I have to tell you that I mean, nearly went into shock. The word came back to us. If you recall, I told you that they had a very animated discussion towards the very end of their meeting. Our major, rather than being the key, and the other major being the lock, and all our major had to do was to turn the key, and the lock would spring open, and their troops would file out and say, "We surrender." It damn near didn't work out that way. The Japanese prisoner said, "I almost joined my friend. I almost joined my friend in going back into the hills and accepting his invitation to jointly commit harikari for the sake of our honor." I said, "Oh boy, that would have been great, wouldn't it? Not only is a mission a failure, but we are losing our prized prisoner." Again, but the epigram, epilogue rather, it goes on to state in a magazine, and you may not recall the magazine, but it was called Collier's Magazine. I've never seen the incident written any place in the world but in this Collier's Magazine. And there's almost some humor attached to it. The author of the magazine was the Marine captain who was scheduled to make the mission, but who unfortunately became ill and couldn't go. Fortunately, he was sound enough to write the story, you see. I'd like to read the opening paragraph, and then to some degree I will continue with this thing here. The title of the story in Collier's Magazine, and very few people, incidentally, there were two major weekly magazines, the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's Magazine. They were two well-done magazines, but somehow or another, to the attrition of time, they disappeared. In this particular issue of the Emperor Said No, the story opens with Okinawa, headline Okinawa. This true story was written on Okinawa as our arms won a grim victory in the Pacific War. And Okinawa was a ferocious battle. I do not know what people home will think of this bizarre drama enacted on an island in the East China Sea, so fantastic that when you speak to any of the principals about it, they invariably begin, "You won't believe it, but this is what happened." The climax of the epilogue. A short time later, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The second was dropped on Nagasaki. And that ended the war. I've regurgitated this experience many times since I spoke at the school. I know there are many details, because of the pressure of time, I have omitted. I do want you to know that no matter what I have told you, I have told you nothing but truth. A tiny piece, a speck, a piece of dust of history. You won't find it anywhere unless I or some other principal tells you about it. And gentlemen, I want to tell you this. The program is finished. I want you to have a rainbow day. And please remember, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow belongs to you. Thank you.